line up. Alright. That's as good as we're going to get. Alright, this probably take 8, I think. Alright, whatever. Beyond the Battles for American Independence by Robert James McMullen. Causes for unrest in the colonies. In the years before the American Revolution, Great Britain had amassed a large amount of war debt from the 7 Years' War, otherwise known as the French and Indian War. Facing this issue, Parliament turned to its North American colonies for relief. It rolled out a series of taxes, most notably the Townshend Acts and the Intolerable Acts, in an effort to levy its war debt. These taxes led to rapidly growing civil unrest in the American colonies, as they were seen as both unnecessary and unjust by the 13 colonies themselves. The Townshend Acts. Enacted in 1767, the Townshend Acts were a series of measures passed taxing paint, glass, lead, tea, and paper, all deemed rather quite important by the North American colonies. The Stamp Act was specifically made to tax all legal documentation, including commercial contracts, newspapers, wills, marriage license, diplomas, pamphlets, and playing cards, requiring all to bear a tax stamp, proving that you had already paid your dues for that stamp. The Tea Act, passed in 1773, was designed to save the East India Trading Company from bankruptcy by granting it lower tax rates, allowing it to become a monopoly in the American tea trade, which was seen as rather unfair to the colonists due to the fact that they were still paying the original tax, and tea itself was a rather heavily dependent on commodity, both by the home country and, of course, the North American colonies. The Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were a series of acts passed by British Parliament to punish the colonists after the Boston Tea Party. These acts include the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, and the Quebec Act of 1774, as well as the Quartering Act. The Administration of Justice Act took away the colonists' ability to self-govern and allowed the military governor to send rebellious colonists to England for trial before a British judge. Now, this was deemed as, quite frankly, a high amount of injustice due to the fact that a military governor would send a colonist who had been protesting taxes made by Parliament, sending it home to the home country to be put in front of a British judge. For obvious reasons, this would be seen as a rather biased trial. The Intolerable Acts, however, would continue anyway through as the Boston Port Act was passed in 1773 by British Parliament. This was the act that closed down the port of Boston and required the city to pay for the tea dumped into the harbor after the Boston Tea Party. Already, Boston as a whole would have difficulty paying it off, let alone with its main port and central trading hub closed. Not exactly a very thought-out plan. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the city of its democratically elected leadership and replaced it with officials appointed by and paid for by the Crown. This was in stark contrast due to the fact that England as a whole had rather disregarded and ignored its North American colonies up until recently, as they had left them to self-govern. The Quebec Act of 1774 granted emancipation for the Catholic French-speaking citizens in the province. It then did away with the Loyalty Act, reintroduced French civil law, and combined it with British criminal law. The Quartering Act was an act requiring citizens to house and feed British troops with their own money for nothing in return, which was seen as rather unfair due to the fact that those troops in question were sent to punish and watch the colonists, and now you suddenly have to feed and house them. Lack of representation. In addition to taxation, the colonists felt as though they were receiving little to no representation in British Parliament. In response to this, Parliament claimed that the colonists were virtually represented, meaning that although they had no representatives from the colonies, they were still represented in government and in Parliament. With colonists being taxed and not having proper representation, the phrase, "no taxation without representation," was eventually coined and used throughout all North American colonies. All of this was reinforced by the Declaratory Act of 1766, which stated that Great Britain held the authority to tax the American colonies just as much as it did the citizens of England, while citizens of England would often argue that not only were they being taxed as much as the colonists, but rather in stark contrast they were being paid more, or taxed more. While technically this was true, the lack of representation was still a major point, as the citizens of England were being represented, while colonists were not. Once fighting broke out, foreign aid was, quite frankly, required. Throughout the American War for Independence, foreign powers such as France, Spain, and the Dutch assisted the Continental Army in their battle against the British. During the war, French aided the colonists primarily through naval support, as the Continental Army had little to no naval forces to speak of. Additionally, they also sent over large amounts of money that America would eventually have to pay off after the American War for Independence, as well as they would send over figures such as Marquis de Lafayette, who would assist the Continental Army at Valley Forge by teaching them proper tactics and properly training them altogether. Spain assisted the colonists by supplying them with gunpowder, supplies, and money to the war effort. They did this due to the fact that they had lost land such as Gibraltar during earlier wars with Great Britain and were hoping to regain them at the end. The Dutch assisted the Americans by providing them with weapons, gunpowder, and ammunition to the Continental Army. Lesser known, or potentially more known, foreign aid was also provided by a Prussian soldier by the name of Baron von Steuben, who showed up at Valley Forge to teach proper tactics, drills, and discipline to the Continental Army, as up until now they had been a militia of farmers, merchants, and other unknowns, and just the people of the colonies. None of them had any proper military training. And that's the end.